Hello and welcome to the Brutal Iron Gym podcast, where our goal is to cut through the BS and deliver the brutal truth about topics related to health and happiness. Today's podcast number 1368. The topic is nutrition and the title is How to Choose the Right Foods. So what I wanted to go through today was basically just kind of discuss three questions that you can ask yourself, or three kind of concepts to consider at each time you are kind of deciding what to eat throughout the day. The three questions are: how have I eaten up to this meal? What will I be doing after this meal? And how long until my next meal? So these are things that I ask myself all day, every time I'm deciding when to eat and what to eat. And these are questions that you will likely have to navigate through that. Now, what we eat actually is not the most impactful aspect of nutrition in regards to controlling body weight, improving body composition, maximizing strength, whatever your kind of desired outcome of your nutrition is. Whether that's, to have better blood work, whether that's to be better performance, whether it's to look better, whatever the desired outcome is, calories is the most impactful component, followed very closely by how much protein is within the calories you have, and then distribution of the calories and protein. And then kind of like the what of what you eat matters. So what you eat does matter, and we do have to decide every time we eat what to eat. So it is a decision that we have to consider. But what you eat doesn't have as much of an impact if what you're eating doesn't have sufficient calories. If what you're eating doesn't have sufficient protein. If what you're eating is at the wrong freaking time of the day compared to when it should have been. So podcast 1232 is a nutrition podcast titled Start Here. Great one to check out if you haven't so far. Gives you kind of the lay of the land of what's the most important components, where you should focus most of your attention first. So once you have kind of all of the basics accounted for, we do want to then consider, okay, well, every time I do eat, what should I eat? Well, that's what we want to go through. And the three questions we're going to consider are: how have I eaten up to this meal? What will I be doing after this meal? How long until my next meal? So let's go through kind of a couple meals that we would encounter throughout the day, such as our first meal of the day. So if I look at the question, how have I eaten up to this meal? It would be that you haven't. So what that means is that your body's coming into that meal in kind of like what would we call it, like a fasted state, meaning that it is undernourished. It needs the calories, it needs the protein, it needs the material of that meal. So this is impactful to know, because if we're going to look at what are the best foods to eat, there's pros and cons out the wazoo. What I want to do today is mostly just talk about considerations, and then you can use that information to apply it for yourself. So something I consider when I look at my morning meals is, since I am coming into that meal in a fasted state, meaning I'm underfed, my body's really needing the food, I don't want to eat something that's very slow digesting. If it's super slow digesting, let's say it's just really high fat content, well, then it's going to be a while until my body really gets those nutrients. By the time my body breaks the food down, can get a decent amount of energy into the bloodstream, then transported to the cells, that's going to be a while. So I tend not to pick very high-fat foods in the morning. Now, something you might want to consider, and you might be like kind of going, wait, hold on a second. Somebody might say, well, if I eat in the morning and I know I'm not going to eat for another, 5, 6, 7 hours, shouldn't I have fats in that meal to help the meal digest slower and last longer until my next meal? That is a factor. That is something to consider. So you might want to have a mixed meal where you have some faster digesting foods, some slower digesting foods, and it's going to kind of blend out in the middle. Now, there are going to be things where on an individual basis, stuff that you would do would be different than what I would do. Stuff that I would say in this podcast as a general recommendation would be different than what you might want to do. So there are individual differences, hence why I have a job and I do nutritional counseling, because there's a lot of unique aspects to nutrition. But there also are just some general concepts that we all can learn, we can all experiment with and apply. So when I look at this morning meal, first meal of the day, the first question, how have I eaten up to this meal? The answer is that I haven't. Therefore, I would like the meal to digest somewhat quickly, so that way my body can get the energy from that meal somewhat quickly. I then look at the second question of what will I be doing after this meal. If I'm going to be super active, maybe it's not a workout, but it's like up and active, running around, moving around. So like when I used to train clients like 10, 12 hours a day, that was standing all the time, talking, moving, doing everything. So that's a consideration that I would have in saying like, okay, I again want foods that would digest quickly because I'm about to go use them. So that would lean again towards faster digesting foods. Now, this is an appropriate time to answer the question of what in the heck are fast digesting foods. I probably should have started to answer that a lot earlier. But generally, carbohydrates are going to be the faster digesting foods. Now, we do have a past podcast discussing carbohydrates, which is podcast number 21, so way the hell back when. Podcast 21 is a nutrition podcast titled Carbs, Good or Bad. And we do talk about carbohydrates, whether they're fast or slow digesting compared to other ones. We have a podcast about fats, which is podcast 29, which is a nutrition podcast titled If I Eat Fat, Will I Get Fat? That talks about dietary fats. In general, fats digest slower than carbohydrates. And then we also have a podcast 216, which is a nutrition podcast titled Protein Digestion and Type Selection. So therefore you can learn about the different digestion rates of proteins as well. So all of this is going to factor into it. It's all going to be something we want to consider. And it all is included and kind of referenced in that podcast 1232 nutrition podcast titled Start Here. So that is something we want to look at. So, first question, how have I eaten up to this meal? I have not eaten, therefore it does lean towards I want foods that digest quickly. Second question, what will I be doing after this meal? If I'm active, I want to again lean towards foods that digest quickly. If I'm not as active, then maybe I do want to have more of a mixed meal where I have some slow digesting elements, some fast digesting elements, so maybe a mixture of carbs and fats. Then the third question is how long until my next meal? This comes into play not only in regards to the types of foods I would pick, but the amount of food that I eat. So if I'm eating a meal, let's just say I'm eating a meal at 7:30, and I know I have another chance to eat around 10:30, and then I'm going to be up and active and maybe do my workout midday. Well, I want to eat at 7:30, whatever gets me to 10:30, but not so much at 7:30 that I'm not hungry enough for my meal for 10:30. But let's say I eat at 7:30 and I'm not going to eat again until 12:30, 5 hours. Well, then I am going to have a higher amount of calories at 7:30 that'll help last until the 12:30 meal. And I might again lean towards fats rather than carbohydrates because they will digest slowly and kind of better sustain the energy during that gap. So there are factors to consider when you're trying to decide on all this stuff. And the challenging part is there's a lot of kind of trial and error that you have to go through. It isn't always, clear cut where, if it's 3 hours, you need X amount of carbohydrates, or if it's 5 hours, you need X amount of fats. It is going to be a little bit of trial and error. So if you eat at 7:30 and all of a sudden you're starving at 10, but you don't get to eat till 12:30, well then you got to eat more at 7:30 the next time, or blend in fats if you notice that you ate mostly carbohydrates. So it's a little bit of trial and error. You do have to kind of pay attention to it a little bit. One of the nice things, though, is once you kind of figure it out, if you play around with it for a week, you'll figure out what you need, and then all of a sudden it becomes very easy and you do it for the rest of your life. So there's another podcast that would help, which is podcast 1021, which is a nutrition podcast titled How Much Carbs and Fats Do I Need? So I often have people ask me, well, you tell me calories I should have, you tell me protein I should have, you tell me the distribution it should be throughout the day, but should I eat carbs at breakfast or at lunch? Should I eat fats, at breakfast or lunch? And that all really depends on what you're doing at the time of the meals. If you're going to be active afterwards, carbohydrates are better. If you're not going to be very active afterwards, fats are better. So that's another podcast that'll help kind of make more sense of this stuff as well. And let's talk through the next couple meals that we might face, and that's going to help us learn more as well. How about a midday meal? So this might be like the meal you have, say, at 12:30 or whatever you're having at whatever your lunchtime is. You again would ask these three questions. How have I eaten up to this meal? What will I be doing after this meal? How long until my next meal? So if I look at what have I eaten or how have I eaten up to this meal, let's say that you missed breakfast. And you're like, okay, I've eaten poorly up to this meal. I really have not eaten enough. I can tell that I'm super hungry. I know that I'm behind in calories. So that would lean towards me eating more calories at this meal than, whatever your normal average number might be. If I'm under eating to this meal, I want to stop that. I want to eat a little extra at this meal so I can stop that under eating aspect now rather than having that carry out the rest of the day. All of a sudden I have huge cravings. I overeat at night, and that causes a lot of fat storage, a lot of cortisol production, just a whole bunch of negatives. So you want to end that right now. Now, if also you look at this question, you say, how have I eaten up to this meal? And you're like, I've eaten fine. So therefore you would want to just stay right on track with your normal caloric intake. You would not want to try to eat extra. Maybe how you've eaten up to this meal was you planned a breakfast. All of a sudden, your work office had, like a party of some kind. There was a couple cookies sitting around, so you ate a couple cookies. So you're like, okay, I'm coming into this meal. I've had a little bit more calories than I anticipated, so I'm going to reduce my calories a little bit at this meal. So that's all that is you just kind of look at that question and say, okay, have I eaten too much, not enough? Where am I at kind of calorie-wise? And this also factors into if you're low in protein in breakfast, you would try to eat a little extra protein at lunch. So you're just trying to adjust based on what you've done up to this meal to see if you can make corrections based on what you've done, good or bad, up to that meal. Second question, what will I be doing after this meal? Great question. Again, this leads to if I'm sitting on my butt not doing much, I can eat slower digesting foods like fats and proteins. If I'm going to be up and active, I want to eat more carbohydrates and proteins. Third question, how long until my next meal? Same kind of concept is if it's going to be a short bout of time, then I want to eat a smaller amount of calories. If it's going to be a longer bout of time, I probably want to eat more calories. Then if we look at the last meal of the day, that's another kind of situation we'll encounter. Well, how have I eaten up to this meal? So if you've overeaten, you want to eat a little bit less. If you've undereaten, you eat a little bit more. If you've eaten right on track, then you stay on track. Second question, what will I be doing after this meal? You'll be going to bed, hopefully. So it is better to lean towards proteins and fats at your last meal of the day rather than carbohydrates. You don't really need carbohydrates right before you go to bed. So it's better to lean towards fats and proteins. Then the third question, how long until my next meal? Well, we know that that's going to be in the morning. So the last meal of the day, you either eat kind of on track depending on the calorie count for the day. So if your daily total calories are on track, then you eat the last meal according to whatever you need to hit your targets. So if you only need 400 calories to hit your target at the last meal of the day, you eat 400 calories. If you need 800 because you're way behind, then unfortunately you have to eat 800 now and then try not to get behind anymore. So you don't have to pile in a bunch of calories right before you go to bed. But it's better to go to bed at the proper caloric amount rather than going to bed underfed, which then prompts you the entire next day for your body to try to store extra calories as body fat to protect itself from going to bed hungry again. So you want to make sure you hit your targets for calories at the end of the day. So therefore, you would eat whatever you need to match your calories targets for the end of the day. Okay. Same with protein. If you're way behind in protein, eat a little more protein at that meal. If you're on point with protein, then follow what you need to get your targets. The other situations we have is like a pre-workout meal. Now this might happen to just be a morning meal. It might happen to be a midday meal. Or maybe you're having something extra special right before the workout. So we look at those three questions. How have you eaten up to this meal? Let's say you're going to go into your workout and you're like, dang, I haven't eaten for a while. I'm low in calories. I don't know how this workout's going to go. Well, then get something in your face. That's going to be helpful. Or if you say, well, I just ate an hour ago. I don't really need calories right now. Well, then great. Then you can skip it. So how have I eaten up to this meal is just, again, kind of a prompt to be aware to adjust based on what you've done up to this point. What will I be doing after this meal? Working out. So if you are going to have anything, have glucose, have sugars, Don't eat anything ultra complex because it's just going to be sitting in your belly while you're trying to work out. You want something that's going to digest very quickly. Sugars are best for that. How long until my next meal? You don't really, before a workout, want to pile in a bunch of food thinking like, well, if I work out and I don't get a chance to eat for an hour or two afterwards, I have to make sure this lasts me 3 hours. Again, you're just going to put stuff in your belly. This is going to tick your belly off because your body is trying to send blood to your gut for digestion, but you're going to be moving your muscles, so it's going to send blood to your muscles. It's going to get angry at you for having two different demands for blood, and one of the ways in which it fixes that is it tells you to throw up. It's like, get this stuff out of my stomach. I don't have blood to deal with this. I have other things I have to do. Get this out, get this out, get this out. All of a sudden you throw up and your body's like, great. Now I can deal with what I wanted to deal with. But you often feel horrible and you don't feel like working out anymore. So now you didn't have the meal and you don't get to work out. So it's a pretty crappy moment there. But it's rare that people are going to throw up, but it does happen. What you'll also just feel is just like lethargic throughout the workout. You won't feel like you got a lot of energy because that food is just sitting in your belly. It hasn't broken down, gotten into your bloodstream, and gotten transported to the muscle cells yet. Then, if we look at post-workout, how have I eaten up to this meal? Well, you just got done working out. You're definitely going to need calories, and you're going to need fast digesting calories. So carbohydrates and proteins are the best choice. Now, let's say that you went into the workout really underfed. Well, then you definitely want to go ahead and kind of add a little bit extra to this post-workout meal, or get that in and then schedule another meal very quickly within the next hour or two. Second question, what will I be doing after this meal? Again, if you're going to be sitting in your butt, focus mostly on proteins and fats. If you're going to be up and active, proteins and carbs. How long until my next meal? And again, you would just say if it's going to be a while, I'll eat more. If it's not going to be a while, I'll eat a little less. So these are just 3 questions that you can consider when you're trying to decide what to eat at each meal. How have I eaten up to this meal? What will I be doing after this meal? How long until my next meal? And these are things you can consider, factor into why you're choosing, the calorie amount, the protein content, and then whether you're focusing mostly on carbs or mostly on fats or a mixture of the two. So hopefully this kind of just gave you some general context, general thoughts, and something that can help make a little more understanding of what to eat per meal. Too often, people think nutrition is very I don't know what the proper word is, except for like they think it's very finite. Like there's only a certain number of foods that are the right foods. And you should have X amount at all times at every meal. And life is way more fluid than that. So there's a lot of food options that are okay. There's a lot of caloric amounts that you need to differ between because life is challenging. One day you have a certain schedule, the next day that schedule might be blown out of the water. So you can't follow nutrition plans that dictate exact foods every single day at the exact same calorie amounts per meal because you're not coming into every meal every day in the exact same situation. So it's better to be able to be fluid and make choices that match the situation you're in rather than trying to follow something that's black and white and very rigid. The more you practice with this, the more confident you'll be. I understand that at first you'll have no clue if you're doing anything right. That is challenging, but that's just part of anything. If I want to learn a new skill, if I want to learn how to be a plumber, I got to learn what the tools are. I got to learn, the manuals of things, and then I have to go try it. I'm going to do some dumb things. I'm going to mess some stuff up, but over time I'm going to get much better, and eventually I can learn to be a good plumber. So that's the same thing with nutrition. You're going to screw some things up, but just go for it. Try things. Listen to as many podcasts as you can to try to learn more and more. The more educated you are, the more aware of what's out there you are, the better choices you can eventually make. Okay, so start with podcast 1232. I mentioned a bunch of other very helpful podcasts, but if you have any questions or anything specific that you would like to learn more about, just email us at brutalirongym@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to make you a podcast. The whole idea of this podcast is just to be available to help people with whatever they want and whatever they need. I want you to live your healthiest and happiest life, and I hope that this podcast can influence that in some way. And the best way for it to do so is for you to ask exactly what you want to know. So again, our email is brutalirongym@gmail.com, and I appreciate if anybody reaches out, lets me know you're alive and you're there. It's good for motivation, it's good for content, and it's good because it helps you. Cool. Well, thank you for listening. If you like today's podcast or a podcast in general, please consider sharing it. The more people we share it with, the more people we can help. Sharing it on social media does reach the most amount of people, but even if you just share in a conversation with a friend, that's a great way to do it as well. Thank you to the patrons of the podcast, the people who financially support the podcast. The podcast is actually well over $1,000 a year for hosting costs. I give an hour to it every day. I would love to keep it for free, not full of a bunch of crazy ads, and I'd love to keep doing it every day because I think it's fun and it's a bunch of good content. So I would love all of this to continue, and the only way that it continues and makes any sense is due to the financial support of our patrons, so thank you very much. If you are considering giving any support to the podcast, you can do so on our website at www.brutalirongym.com. You do a one-time donation, monthly donation, yearly donation, however you do it. I appreciate that you do it very, very much. Actually, we all appreciate it, so that way we all can benefit from this. If you like the information we share in our podcast, you can find more from us on our social media channels on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube under the name Brutal Iron Gym. If you have any questions, feedback, suggestions, anything that you want to know, let us know at our email at brutalirongym@gmail.com. As always, I hope this was helpful, and thank you for listening.